Maria never imagined that bringing homemade soup to her sick mother would result in the most degrading experience of her life. Harrison's entitled wife decided to publicly assault her in front of dozens of witnesses. She had no idea that Maria's husband was about to arrive and destroy their entire world in ways they never saw coming. Sometimes life has a way of testing you when you least expect it. It strips away all pretense and shows you exactly what people are made of when they think nobody important is watching. This is the story of one woman's humiliation and the justice that followed. Maria Rodriguez had always been the kind of person who flew under the radar, and she preferred it that way. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 32 years old, she found joy in life's quieter moments, reading mystery novels on rainy afternoons, tending to her small herb garden, and especially cooking traditional recipes her grandmother had taught her decades ago. Her husband David traveled frequently for work, leaving Maria to manage their household and care for her aging mother Elena, who lived across town. That Thursday morning in October started like any other. The leaves outside her kitchen window had turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and there was a crisp energy in the air that made everything feel fresh and new. Maria had risen early to prepare her mother's favorite chicken and vegetable soup, a recipe that had been passed down through 3 generations of women in her family. The soup simmered on the stove for hours, filling the house with the comforting aroma of bay leaves, garlic, and slow-cooked vegetables. Maria hummed softly as she worked, carefully straining the broth and adjusting the seasoning until it was perfect. She knew her mother had been struggling with her appetite since starting the new medication, but this soup had always been Elena's weakness. After ladling the warm soup into a large thermos and packing some fresh bread rolls in a cloth bag, Maria dressed in her most comfortable clothes for the hospital visit. She chose a simple navy blue cardigan over a white cotton blouse paired with well-worn jeans and her favorite walking shoes. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she carried everything in a large canvas tote bag that had seen better days but remained sturdy and reliable. The Metropolitan General Hospital loomed against the gray October sky, its concrete facade and countless windows giving it an imposing institutional feel. Maria had become all too familiar with this building over the past few months as her mother underwent treatment for a chronic condition that seemed to worsen rather than improve with each passing week. Walking through the main entrance, Maria navigated the maze of hallways with the confidence of someone who had made this journey many times before. The hospital smelled of industrial disinfectant and recycled air, punctuated by the occasional whiff of cafeteria food or the floral arrangements that well-meaning visitors brought to bright and sterile rooms. Elena Rodriguez occupied a bed in the general medical ward, sharing her room with 3 other patients who were dealing with their own health challenges. The room itself was cramped and utilitarian, with pale green walls that seemed designed to drain any remaining color from the faces of those unfortunate enough to spend time there. When Maria arrived, she found her mother propped up against several pillows, looking smaller and more fragile than she had just a few days earlier. Elena's face brightened when she saw her daughter, and Maria felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came from seeing someone you love struggling with illness. They spent a pleasant hour together, with Elena managing to finish nearly half the thermos of soup while Maria updated her on neighborhood news and gossip from their old church. For the first time in weeks, her mother seemed genuinely interested in eating, and Maria felt a surge of satisfaction knowing that her cooking had provided some small comfort. As visiting hours began to wind down, Maria gathered her empty thermos and prepared to leave. The general medical ward had become increasingly busy throughout the afternoon, with medical staff, visitors, and patients moving constantly through the corridors. The noise level had risen considerably, creating an atmosphere of controlled chaos that seemed to energize some people while exhausting others. Maria was walking toward the elevator bank, her canvas bag slung over her shoulder and the empty thermos tucked safely inside, when she collided with someone coming around the corner from the opposite direction. The impact was minor, barely more than a gentle bump, but it was enough to cause the other person to stumble slightly and drop the designer handbag she had been carrying. The woman Maria had bumped into was everything she was not. Tall and striking, with platinum blonde hair styled in perfect waves that seemed to defy the hospital's sterile environment. She wore a cream-colored designer coat that probably cost more than Maria made in several months, paired with matching leather boots that clicked authoritatively against the hospital's linoleum floors. Her jewelry caught the harsh fluorescent lighting and threw it back in brilliant flashes, from the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist to the elaborate earrings that framed her carefully made-up face. Everything about her screamed wealth and privilege, from her manicured fingernails to the subtle but expensive perfume that created a cloud of luxury around her presence. Maria immediately began apologizing, reaching down to help retrieve the scattered contents of the woman's handbag. She had been raised to take responsibility for accidents, even minor ones, and her instinct was always to make things right when possible. But before Maria could finish gathering the woman's belongings, she found herself face to face with an expression of pure fury. The blonde woman's eyes, enhanced with expertly applied makeup, blazed with an anger that seemed completely disproportionate to the minor collision they had just experienced. "How dare you?" the woman hissed, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from never being challenged or contradicted. "Do you have any idea what you've done? This handbag costs more than you probably make in a year, and now look at it." Maria glanced at the handbag in question, which appeared to be completely undamaged despite its brief contact with the hospital floor. There were no scuff marks, no tears in the leather, nothing that would indicate any actual harm had occurred. But the woman continued her verbal assault as if Maria had deliberately destroyed something priceless. "I'm very sorry," Maria said quietly, hoping to de-escalate the situation before it attracted more attention. "It was completely accidental. I wasn't watching where I was going, and I take full responsibility." Her apology only seemed to inflame the woman further. Sorry doesn't fix anything. Do you see this coat? These shoes? Everything I'm wearing is designer, and now I'll have to have it all cleaned because you couldn't be bothered to watch where you were walking." The commotion was beginning to draw attention from other people in the corridor. Nurses paused their conversations to glance over, visitors slowed their pace to observe the unfolding drama, and even some patients who were mobile enough to leave their rooms had emerged to see what was causing the disturbance. Maria felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment as more and more people began to stare. She had always been someone who preferred to blend into the background, and finding herself at the center of a public confrontation was her worst nightmare come to life. "Please," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've already apologized. Is there something I can do to make this right?"
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The blonde woman stepped closer, invading Maria's personal space in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. "Make this right? Look at yourself. Look at those clothes, that hair, that cheap bag you're carrying. You don't belong in a place like this, bumping into your betters and causing problems." The words hit Maria like physical blows. She looked down at her simple outfit, suddenly seeing it through this woman's eyes and feeling ashamed of her practical choices. The cardigan that had seemed perfectly appropriate that morning now felt shabby and worn. Her comfortable shoes looked scuffed and cheap compared to the woman's gleaming leather boots. "My name is Victoria Harrison," the woman announced loudly enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear clearly. "My husband is Dr. Marcus Harrison, the chief of cardiothoracic surgery at this hospital. I've been coming here for 15 years and I've never been treated with such disrespect." The name seemed to have an immediate effect on the hospital staff who had gathered to watch the confrontation. Several nurses exchanged glances that suggested they recognized Dr. Harrison's reputation and understood the potential consequences of crossing his wife. Victoria Harrison seemed to feed off the recognition and the attention it brought her. Her voice grew louder and more authoritative as she continued her public humiliation of Maria. "People like you need to learn to stay in their place. This is a medical facility, not some charity kitchen where you can just wander around bumping into people who matter." Maria felt tears beginning to sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of this crowd. She had done nothing wrong except accidentally bump into someone in a busy hospital corridor, but Victoria Harrison was treating her like she had committed some terrible crime. "I was just visiting my mother," Maria said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to remain composed. "She's a patient here, and I brought her some soup because she hasn't been eating well." Victoria's laugh was cold and dismissive. "Your mother? What ward is she in? The charity cases? The welfare patients who can't afford proper medical care?" The comment was designed to humiliate, and it succeeded. Maria felt her face burning with shame and anger, but she was surrounded by hostile faces and had no idea how to defend herself against someone with such obvious power and influence. "Listen carefully," Victoria continued, stepping even closer to Maria. "I want you to understand something very clearly. This hospital caters to important people, successful people, people who contribute something meaningful to society. We don't need random women shuffling around here with their homemade soup and their thrift store clothes making the place look shabby." The corridor had gone almost completely silent except for Victoria's voice, which seemed to echo off the walls with each cruel word. Maria could see hospital staff members watching from their stations, but none of them seemed willing to intervene on behalf of someone who clearly had no power or influence. That's when it happened. Without any warning, without any additional provocation, Victoria Harrison raised her hand and delivered a sharp, stinging slap across Maria's face.
The sound echoed through the corridor like a gunshot, and the silence that followed was deafening. Maria stood there in shock, her hand instinctively rising to touch her burning cheek. She had never been struck by a stranger before, never been subjected to such public violence and humiliation. The physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of being treated like something less than human in front of dozens of witnesses. Victoria seemed as surprised as anyone by her own actions, but she quickly recovered and used the moment to assert even more dominance. "Let that be a lesson to you about respecting your betters," she declared triumphantly. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before causing problems for people who actually matter." The crowd that had gathered seemed frozen in shock. Some people looked uncomfortable with what they had witnessed, but no one stepped forward to help Maria or challenge Victoria's behavior. The power dynamics were too clear, too established, and everyone understood their place in the hospital's social hierarchy. Maria stood there for what felt like an eternity, her cheek throbbing and her dignity in tatters. She wanted to respond, wanted to defend herself, wanted to point out the injustice of what had just occurred. But surrounded by hostile faces and overwhelmed by the public nature of her humiliation, she felt completely powerless. Gathering what little composure she could manage, Maria clutched her canvas bag tightly and began walking toward the elevator. Each step felt like a mile, and she could feel every person in the corridor following her movement. Victoria Harrison's satisfied laughter followed her down the hallway, a sound that would echo in Maria's memory for a very long time. As the elevator doors closed behind her, Maria finally allowed the tears to fall. She stood alone in the small metal box, her reflection staring back at her from the polished walls, her red cheek a stark reminder of what had just occurred. For the first time in her adult life, she felt truly small and powerless, wondering how the simple act of bringing soup to her sick mother had led to such a devastating encounter with cruelty and privilege. Maria stood in the hospital parking garage, her hands trembling as she fumbled with her phone. The concrete walls seemed to press in around her, amplifying the sound of her ragged breathing and the distant hum of traffic from the street above. Her cheeks still burned from Victoria Harrison's slap, and she could taste the salt of tears that continued to fall despite her efforts to stop them. She needed to call David, needed to hear his voice, needed someone to remind her that she was worth more than the treatment she had just endured. But as she scrolled through her contacts, her vision blurred by tears and her hands shaking with residual shock, she heard the distinctive sound of expensive tires on concrete echoing through the parking structure. The sound grew closer, more pronounced, until a gleaming black Bentley Bentayga rounded the corner and glided smoothly toward the visitor parking area. The vehicle was magnificent, its polished surface reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights of the garage like a mirror. Even in her distressed state, Maria recognized the car immediately. It was David's newest acquisition, a symbol of success that he rarely drove to public places, preferring to keep his wealth and status private. The driver's door opened, and David Rodriguez stepped out with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. He was dressed in his signature style, impeccably tailored but understated. His charcoal wool suit was perfectly fitted, his Italian leather shoes gleamed even in the artificial light, and his dark hair was styled with the kind of precision that spoke of expensive grooming. But it was his presence that truly commanded attention, an aura of quiet confidence and unmistakable authority. David's eyes found Maria across the parking garage, and his expression immediately shifted from casual concern to intense focus. He could see her distress from 50 feet away, could read the tension in her posture and the way she held herself protectively. In 3 quick strides he was beside her, his strong hands gently taking her shoulders as he examined her face. The red mark on her cheek was impossible to miss, and David's jaw tightened as he processed what he was seeing. His normally warm brown eyes grew cold and dangerous, but his voice remained gentle when he spoke to his wife. "Maria, what happened to you? Who did this?" She collapsed against his chest, finally allowing herself to feel safe enough to break down completely. Through her tears she told him everything. The accidental collision, Victoria Harrison's verbal assault, the public humiliation, and finally the slap that had left its mark on both her face and her spirit. David listened without interruption, his arms wrapped protectively around his wife as she recounted each detail of her ordeal. With every word, his expression grew more serious, more focused, more determined. When Maria finished her story, David gently lifted her chin so he could look directly into her eyes. "No one has the right to treat you this way," he said firmly. "No one. Victoria Harrison is about to learn a very expensive lesson about respect and consequences." He guided Maria to the passenger seat of the Bentley, making sure she was comfortable before retrieving his phone from his jacket pocket. As they drove toward the hospital entrance, David made a series of calls that would set in motion events Victoria Harrison could never have anticipated. James, it's David Rodriguez. I need you to pull all documentation on our medical investments, specifically anything related to Metropolitan General Hospital. Yes, immediately. And call Sarah in legal, tell her we might need acquisition paperwork prepared on short notice. The first call was followed by several others, each one brief and precise, each one setting another piece of a complex puzzle into place. Maria listened with growing amazement as her husband orchestrated what sounded like a major business operation from the front seat of their car. As they pulled up to the hospital's main entrance, David handed his keys to the valet with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to such service. He took Maria's hand and walked through the main lobby with purposeful strides, his presence immediately noticeable to everyone they passed. The hospital's afternoon shift was in full swing, with medical staff, visitors and administrators moving through the corridors in their usual patterns. But as David and Maria made their way toward the general medical ward, conversation stopped and heads turned. There was something magnetic about David's presence, something that demanded attention and respect without any effort on his part. When they reached the corridor where Maria's humiliation had taken place just an hour earlier, they found Victoria Harrison exactly where Maria had left her. She was holding court near the nurses' station, regaling a small group of staff members with what appeared to be her version of the earlier incident. Victoria's voice carried clearly down the hallway as she described how she had been forced to discipline some inappropriate woman who had been causing trouble in the hospital. She seemed to be enjoying the attention, playing up her role as the wronged party who had bravely stood up to someone who didn't belong. But her narrative came to an abrupt halt when she saw David Rodriguez walking toward her with unmistakable purpose. Even from a distance, something about his bearing and presence made it clear that this was not an ordinary hospital visitor. The expensive cut of his suit, the confidence in his stride, and the way other people stepped aside to let him pass all suggested someone of considerable importance. Victoria's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to curious concern as David approached. She clearly didn't recognize him, but she possessed enough social awareness to understand that his presence represented something significant. The small group of staff members she had been entertaining began to disperse, sensing that whatever was about to happen was beyond their pay grade. "Excuse me," David said, his voice carrying the kind of polite authority that brooks no argument. "Are you Victoria Harrison?" Victoria straightened up, clearly pleased to be recognized by someone who obviously moved in influential circles. "Yes, I am. And you are?" "David Rodriguez," he replied simply, as if the name should mean something to her. "I believe you've already met my wife, Maria." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. Her eyes darted to Maria, taking in the expensive Bentley keys David still held, the unmistakable quality of his clothing, and the way he carried himself with absolute confidence. The simple woman she had humiliated and struck was married to someone who clearly possessed significant wealth and power. "Your wife?" Victoria stammered, her composure beginning to crack around the edges. "I am sure there's been some misunderstanding. We had a minor accident earlier." "Nothing serious." David's smile was cold and completely without humor. "A minor accident? Is that what you call publicly humiliating my wife and then slapping her in front of dozens of witnesses?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and Victoria could see that their conversation was beginning to attract attention from hospital staff and visitors. But this time the attention felt different, more threatening, focused on her rather than supportive of her position. "Rodriguez, I'm sure we can discuss this reasonably," Victoria said, her voice taking on a pleading tone that was completely different from the authoritative arrogance she had displayed earlier. "Perhaps we could speak privately in my husband's office?" "Your husband," David repeated thoughtfully. "Dr. Marcus Harrison, Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery." "Yes, I'd very much like to meet your husband." Before Victoria could respond, David was already walking toward the elevator bank, clearly expecting to be followed. Victoria hurried after him, her designer heels clicking frantically against the linoleum floor as she struggled to keep up with his determined pace. The ride to the administrative floors was conducted in tense silence, with Victoria becoming increasingly agitated as she began to understand that this situation was spiraling far beyond her control. When the elevator doors opened on the executive level, David stepped out with the confidence of someone who belonged there, despite never having visited the hospital's administrative offices before. Dr. Marcus Harrison's office was located at the end of a carpeted hallway lined with expensive artwork and awards celebrating the hospital's achievements. The nameplate on his door was polished brass, and everything about the space spoke of institutional power and medical prestige. Victoria knocked hesitantly before opening the door, clearly hoping to prepare her husband for what was about to unfold. But David was not interested in giving her time to craft an explanation or spin the story in her favor. Dr. Harrison was a man in his late 50s with graying hair and the kind of confident demeanor that comes from years of making life and death decisions. He looked up from his desk with mild curiosity as his wife entered, followed by two people he didn't recognize. "Marcus, this is David Rodriguez and his wife," Victoria began, but David cut her off before she could continue. "Dr. Harrison, your wife assaulted my wife in your hospital corridor approximately 1 hour ago. She publicly humiliated her, called her trash, and then slapped her across the face in front of dozens of witnesses." The directness of the accusation left Dr. Harrison speechless for a moment. He looked from David to Maria, noticing for the first time the faint red mark that was still visible on her cheek, then back to his wife, whose face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "That's impossible," Dr. Harrison said automatically. "Victoria would never do such a thing. There must be some misunderstanding." David pulled out his phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be a series of messages and notifications. "There's no misunderstanding, doctor, and I'm afraid the consequences are going to be quite severe." As if on cue, Dr. Harrison's desk phone began ringing. He answered it with growing confusion as his secretary informed him that he had urgent calls waiting from the hospital's board of directors, the chief financial officer, and several department heads. The timing seemed too coincidental to be random. "Dr. Harrison," David continued while the doctor dealt with his phone calls, "I assume you're familiar with Rodriguez Medical Solutions." The name clearly meant something to Dr. Harrison, whose expression grew increasingly concerned as he processed the implications. Rodriguez Medical Solutions was one of the largest medical equipment and pharmaceutical suppliers in the region, with contracts worth millions of dollars annually. "You're that Rodriguez?" Dr. Harrison asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am. And as of today, Rodriguez Medical Solutions will be terminating all contracts with Metropolitan General Hospital. We'll also be withdrawing our funding for the new cardiac wing, canceling our equipment leasing agreements, and ending our pharmaceutical supply arrangements." The blood drained from Dr. Harrison's face as he began to understand the magnitude of what David was describing. The Rodriguez contracts represented a significant portion of the hospital's operational budget and future expansion plans. "But that's not all," David continued calmly. "I've also instructed my legal team to begin acquisition proceedings for this hospital. Metropolitan General has been struggling financially for several years, and I believe new ownership might be exactly what this institution needs." Victoria had collapsed into a chair, her earlier arrogance completely evaporated in the face of consequences she could never have imagined. The simple woman she had humiliated was married to someone with the power to destroy not only her husband's career, but the entire hospital where he worked. "Mr. Rodriguez, please," Dr. Harrison pleaded. "Whatever my wife did, I'm sure we can resolve this situation. There must be some way to make this right." David's expression remained impassive. "Your wife didn't just insult my wife, doctor. She physically assaulted her in a public space, in front of your staff and patients. She demonstrated exactly the kind of entitled, discriminatory behavior that has no place in a medical facility." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over everyone in the room. "But you're right about one thing. There is a way to make this right." Both Dr. Harrison and Victoria leaned forward expectantly, clearly hoping for some path to redemption that might salvage their careers and reputation. "Your wife will publicly apologize to my wife in the same corridor where the assault took place in front of as many witnesses as possible. She will acknowledge her behavior was unacceptable and commit to sensitivity training. Additionally, both of you will resign from your positions at this hospital effective immediately." The demands hit the room like thunderbolts. Victoria began crying, finally understanding that her moment of cruel satisfaction was going to cost her everything she valued. Harrison sat in stunned silence, realizing that his career and reputation were being destroyed by his wife's actions. "And if we refuse?" Dr. Harrison asked quietly. David's smile was thin and completely without warmth. "Then I proceed with the acquisition and you'll both be terminated anyway, but without the dignity of resignation and without any possibility of positive references for future employment." The choice wasn't really a choice at all, and everyone in the room understood that fact. Doctor. Harrison looked at his wife with a mixture of anger and disappointment that spoke volumes about the state of their marriage. Victoria Harrison, who had wielded her husband's position like a weapon just hours earlier, now sat broken and defeated by the consequences of her own cruelty. 30 minutes later, a crowd had gathered in the same corridor where Maria's humiliation had begun. Word had spread quickly through the hospital that something extraordinary was happening, and staff members, patients, and visitors had come to witness what promised to be an unprecedented event. Victoria Harrison stood in the center of the corridor, her designer outfit now seeming ridiculous rather than impressive. Her makeup was smeared from crying, her perfect hair was disheveled, and her hands shook as she prepared to deliver the most humiliating speech of her life. I want to publicly apologize to Maria Rodriguez for my inexcusable behavior earlier today. Victoria began, her voice barely audible. I was wrong to judge her based on her appearance. I was wrong to humiliate her publicly, and I was absolutely wrong to strike her. There is no excuse for my actions, and I deeply regret the pain I caused. The apology continued for several more minutes, with Victoria acknowledging each aspect of her cruel behavior and accepting full responsibility for the consequences that followed. When she finished, the corridor was completely silent except for the sound of her quiet sobbing. David stepped forward to address the crowd that had gathered. Let this serve as a reminder that respect and dignity are not privileges to be earned based on someone's appearance or perceived social status. They are basic human rights that everyone deserves, regardless of their circumstances. As the crowd began to disperse, Dr. Harrison approached David one final time. Mr. Rodriguez, is there anything I can do to change your mind about the contracts? David considered the question for a moment before responding. Actually, there is. I want you to establish a patient advocacy program specifically focused on ensuring that all patients and their families are treated with respect regardless of their ability to pay or their social status. Fund it properly, staff it adequately, and make it a genuine priority. Dr. Harrison nodded eagerly. Yes, absolutely. We can have that program operational within a month. Good, David replied. Because I'll be monitoring its effectiveness very carefully. As David and Maria walked toward the hospital exit for the final time that day, Maria felt a complex mixture of emotions. The justice had been swift and complete, but she took no joy in Victoria Harrison's destruction. If anything, she felt sad that such cruelty had existed in the first place. Do you think she learned anything from this? Maria asked as they reached their car. David opened the passenger door for his wife, considering her question carefully. I hope so. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones that matter most. 6 months later, Maria received a handwritten letter in the mail. It was from Victoria Harrison, who had enrolled in social work classes and was volunteering at a homeless shelter. The letter was brief but heartfelt, thanking Maria for teaching her something she said would change her life forever. Maria never responded to the letter, but she didn't throw it away either. It sits in her desk drawer as a reminder that everyone deserves a second chance to become a better person, and that sometimes justice and compassion can work together to create something meaningful from even the darkest situations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.